where the Vaishnavas, why they really invest so much in opposing Advaita. It's because Advaita tells them that their beloved Bhagavan is Maya.
Right, so welcome again, Edwin, to this version, this particular yoga chat on Advaita Vedanta. So we're going to try and understand the root concepts of Advaita today. It's really popular in the West these days. There's loads of Western Advaita teachers swinging around. There's Neo-Advaita, but it gets a little bit confused. And I'm actually confused myself about what exactly Advaita means. And so who better perhaps to help us but Edwin. So yeah, I mean, basically in a nutshell, what is it? Is it something to do with, it's non-dual basically, right? My understanding is, yeah, right.
Well, Advaita is one stream of Vedanta.
Right.
And Vedanta is the stream of, it's basically exegesis, which means interpretation of sacred texts. And so the Vedanta is that exegetical stream that flows from the Upanishads. So the foundational text is the Upanishads. So the Upanishads are considered Shruti, that which was heard. They're the most sacred of texts, even more, you know, just like the Islam has the Quran and then it has the Hadith. But if there's any sort of conflict, the Quran comes out on top. And the Hadith is sort of accumulated material that's accepted as authoritative, as provided it doesn't contradict the Quran. It's a bit like that. You have the Shruti, which are the Vedas and the Upanishads and a couple of other things that we don't need to worry about. And then the most sacred texts of Hinduism. So all later schools, whether it's Tantra or Shaiva or Vaiṣṇava or Krishna, they have to find some kind of peg in the Upanishads, right? Something in the Upanishads that they can say, well, this is really, our tradition is indicated here in seed form, and we've taken that seed and we've developed it, right? So the Tantrikas have, you know, there's a couple of places in the Upanishad that speak of nadis. They say, oh, look, that's the subtle physiology. Even, you know, Kundalini might not be mentioned, but as long as something. Krishna's not mentioned, but you might have some kind of a theistic statement, or there's one reference to, anyway. So in this way, the Upanishads are kind of like, if you want to be an Orthodox Hindu, this is the crux of the matter. Mm-hmm. Or you don't want to go off and start your own thing. You want to say, I'm a Vedika, I'm follow the Vedic system. You can't just make stuff up. You have to find some kind, just like if you want to be a Christian, you know, you might say, I don't know, you might say Christ was an alien who came for, but you have to find some way of situating that in the Bible. And you have to look here, that UFOs, whatever it is, right? That's being a bit ridiculous, but you get the point. So given that, the Upanishads then become, because the old Vedas are so completely different, you know, hymns to the, you know, it's really the Upanishads where the schools find their point of origin. So
what was the time difference, by the way, in between the Vedas and the Upanishads?
Well, if you go by academic dates, you've got centuries. You know, the Vedas are probably dated 1500 BCE to 1200 BC would be the Vedas, and the oldest Upanishad, like the Brihad, would be 8th century, so a few centuries later.
And just as an aside, particularly because someone really wanted to know this, when was yoga first mentioned in the Vedas? Was it mentioned in the Vedas at all?
Katara and the Katha Upanishads. It's not mentioned.
Okay.
Before Vedas, no.
Right.
And if it's mentioned, it means something else. I mean, these terms have earlier meanings that are not the same as the later meanings. But just to finish that point, then.
Yeah. So
the problem with the Upanishad, I don't know if it's a problem, but the nature of the Upanishads, it's not systematic philosophy. They're kind of like, you know, different sages articulating different truths and so forth. And there's a lot going on there. There's scholars who actually don't read the Upanishads and see it more as rivalry between political kingdoms and so on. But Vedanta wants to read the Upanishads, the primary teaching of the Upanishads, to be about Brahman, right? So the first verse of the I'm getting to your question about Advaita. Just give me a second to.
No. It's very interesting.
We'll end up there.
Yeah.
So I got my eye on the ball. I hope. So then the first statement of the Vedanta is Atato Brahma Jignasu. Like the first verse of Yoga Sutras is Atta Yoga Anushasana. And right now we're going to do. continue teachings of yoga. Well, in a similar fashion, the first verse of Vedanta is Tato Brahma Jignasu. Now we're going to inquire into Brahman. So for the Vedantins, the real purpose of the Upanishads, the primary teachings, is about Brahman. Now, what is this Brahman, and what is its relationship with the world, and what is its relation, and what is the living entity's role in that triad of entities? The Upanishads themselves don't take systematic, in some places it appears that Brahman is a personal being who decided and willed creation. In some places, these souls are are presented as little monads, individualized monads. But in other places, it seems like the souls are not really individual monads. And when they, like rivers, they eventually flow to the sea and become one with the sea. That's one of the famous passages. So it seems to be it seems to be the soul seems to be presented as somehow one or even merging into Brahman. So there's all of these possibilities. Now, if you're a Vedantin or if you're an Orthodox Hindu, you can't say Upanishads are disorganized. You can't say, oh, they're incoherent. You can't say they're conflicting or contradictory. You can't say that because they're divine revelation. You don't want divine revelation to be imperfect. So you have to say, no, they're perfect divine revelation, but we need a lens. And if we look at them through this lens, we will see they're perfectly consistent. And that's why you have, so then the Vedanta Sutras are written by a sage called Badarayana, just like Patanjali writes. The Yoga Sutras, he's also trying to schematize all these previous references to yoga here and there in the Upanishads, in the Mahabharata. He wants to, he schematizes it. And from that point on, the Yoga Sutras becomes the go-to canonical text for yoga. So the Vedanta Sutras was written for similar sorts of reasons. The problem with the Vedanta Sutras are they're so cryptic. You can't understand. The sutra may be 2 or 3 words, no verb, and it's referring to some passage in the Upanishad, but it doesn't tell you which reference. It doesn't tell you. So therefore, so even though the Vedanta was supposed to systematize the Upanishads, you now have to not only interpret the Upanishads, you now have to interpret the Vedanta Sutra, because probably these were oral traditions. And so centuries after the Vedanta Sutra, we have the first commentator, Shankara, comes along in the 8th to 9th century. That could be, let's go with academic dates. Of course, Hindus would date them much, much older. It doesn't matter, who cares? Let's say the academic date, let's say Vedanta's dated at like 3rd century or something like that. 3rd century, the Common Era. I mean, some dated, 3rd century BCE. I'm a bit wobbly on the dates because it's been a while since I looked at that. But anyway, many centuries later, along comes Shankara. And his way of reconciling the apparent conflicting statements of the Upanishads and the lens that he offers, so this is Advaita.
Yeah.
In a minute.
Yeah.
He says, when the Upanishads talk about a real world, a real creation with a real creator, with souls, they're talking about conventional, apparent, very important word, apparent reality. Right. But when the Upanishads speak about, that Brahman is beyond form and beyond name, and the world is unreal, and the souls merge into Brahman, then they're talking from the perspective of Paramarthika, it's ultimate, real, genuine reality. So he creates this 2-tiered schema. And all passages in the Upanishads that speak of undivided, impersonal Brahman, he says, now they're talking from the Paramarthika, the highest perspective. And all passages that talk about real souls and real world and real God and real creation, that's just conventional. So the conventional reality is unreal. It's Jagat Mityam, Brahman Satyam, Jagat Mityam. The world is unreal. The individuality of the soul is unreal. The creation is unreal. So ultimately, a creator is unreal. It is real in conventional reality. He'll defend it when he's debating Sankhya and other schools. He'll defend Ishvara against the Sankhya traditions. But when he's doing that, he's doing it from if the world was real, well, of course it has to have a creator. Right, so in that sense, he's like intelligent. He would support intelligent design, but ultimately it's unreal. So How do we get from there? So therefore, on that ultimate highest reality, Advaita, there are no dualities. What are the dualities? Well, the duality between one soul and another soul, that's a duality. A duality between the soul and Brahman, that's another duality. The duality between Brahman and the world, another duality. The duality within the world between one ingredient, ultimate metaphysical category of reality and another duality. Dualities between God and creation, all of that for him, all of that is illusory. And
if I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second. I mean, that itself is a duality, isn't it? A false and a real gives a, I mean, how does he escape that position? Well, or are we coming on to that?
We're coming on to that. Right. His opponents consider that to be his Achilles heel.
It is a bit of an Achilles heel. Is this the uninvolved name and form part?
Well, the Achilles heel is if you say everything is illusion, then what is illusion?
Yeah, but it's a dualistic perspective. Yeah.
Is it in? You can't be in Brahman because that's saying darkness is in the sun.
There's two things.
That is impossible. It can't be outside of Brahman because then you have a duality. It can't be covering a part of Brahman, which is what Vaiṣṇavas say, because then you have a duality within Brahman. So Shankara doesn't address this issue, but later, right after him, it becomes a major point of contention, and as the tradition says, it's anirvachaniya. It cannot be spoken about. It's beyond comprehension, which obviously is not a philosophical sort of thing to say, but that's not going to satisfy any of his opponents, and who are going to say, right, you want to say the world is unreal? All right, let's have a little think about that. What is this unreality? What is this Maya? And what's the relationship between Maya and Brahman? Because you just hit the nail on the head. That points to a duality. And that is the major argument that has been handed down since Shankara's time for 1200 years. As Ramanuja puts it, the next great Vedantin, Kasya avidya, in Sanskrit, Kasya avidya, whose avidya is this? Where are you going to locate it without creating a duality? So you really got that bit. But let me just tidy up, and then we'll move on to why is it so popular? I don't know if that's speculation on that. So, so therefore, just the word Dvaita is cognate with Latin duo, right? Duo. In English, we have dual. Actually, the English word two, the T and the D and the U and the W. So that's all cognate. All goes back to an Indo-European root, pointing to some kind of a binary. And then is a negator. So just like we have theist, atheist, even today in English, we've inherited that old Indo-European negator. So Advaita means no dualities whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So that's the classical Advaita position. So even though, Shankara wrote poetry and he wrote all this, Bhaja Govinda, he wrote this devotional poetry. You go down to the Sringeri Mutt in South India, the stronghold, they're all doing pujas and temples and ringing bells, but for them, this is only sadhana. It's only practice that when we're in the world of illusion, we have to do these things. But the point is to eventually get to a place where you're beyond all of that and you realize there is no Ishvara, there are no temples, there is no you offering bhakti to somebody else. There are no dualities at all, but you may need to use dualities to get just like Patanjali, you have to use the mind to get beyond the mind, a bit like that. So that's classical Advaita. Along come the dualist traditions, and they pick this apart intensely. I think most scholars, and they argue for a real world, real souls who are individual. They don't merge at all, neither in this world, neither in the liberated state. They remain individuals, which is, by the way, the position of almost all schools of Indian philosophy. Buddhists would hold that view in their own way, that the flow of the interdependent flow of consciousness, one is different from another. They don't talk of merging. Jainism, absolutely. All the other Vaiṣṇava Vedanta traditions, Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Mimamsa, out of the 6 schools of Indian philosophy, they all are, what should we call it?
And there's Vedanta as well, isn't there? There's not, some Vedanta is Dvaita Vedanta, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
It's just, it's not so well known in the West, although actually the Iyengar tradition and the Krishnamacharya tradition, many people don't know this about that because they're not interested in Vedanta. That's completely anti-Shankara. Those positions, Ramanuja If you look at the founder of that lineage, you look at his Vedanta Sutra, it's about English translation, 500 pages or so, 100 pages before he even starts 111, first chapter, first section, first verse, 100 pages, anti-Advaita, pointing out the defects and the philosophical problems of the Advaita position. So this is actually one of the leelas of Vedanta. You know, one of the sort of what you do if you're a Vedantin is you study your philosophy and you study the other philosophy, and you learn the defects of the other philosophy called the Purva. Part of being a Vedantin, you don't just study Vedanta Sutra, you study your tradition's interpretation in opposition to Shankara. But yeah, Shankara, what I would call Neo-Advaita, just like Neo-Yoga, is been exported to the West, and we can talk about that if you want.
Well, I mean, the two other obvious arguments are, what about suffering? Like, I mean, how can Brahmin be involved in suffering, right? Like, if everything is one, you know, like, what is this suffering in the world? And how did the one become the many? There's obviously a multitude of things, right? I mean, why and wherefore did that happen? I mean, you know, so those are the three, I think, obvious arguments that people put to Shankara, right? Or to Advaita, at least, maybe not to Shankara himself.
Absolutely. And of course, Shankara will just say, ultimately would say it's ultimately unreal, which is if you have to decide whether that's a satisfactory argument.
Bit of a cop-out, isn't it?
If your lower back is really killing you, you know.
Seems real. Suffering seems real. I mean, also that kind of argument, which I've heard put to people, is like, well, it's not, your suffering isn't really real. It doesn't really wash it with people that are ostensibly suffering, right? You know.
Well, I mean, you know, you can put it this way: Shankara's opponents find his philosophy utterly incoherent.
Really?
Oh, not only. Oh, absolutely. And they put it. They actually say that. They say this is, you know, Ramanuja will say this is the babble of an immature mind. You know, they'll say things like that. Absolutely, yeah. And the most aggressive, polemically, is the person who even calls his philosophy Dvaita, right in your face, Dvaita. Ramanuja becomes the first one. He says, okay, Vishishta Dvaita. He keeps the Advaita. Right. Obviously, everything is God, but Vishishta, there's differences within that Advaita. There's God, and there's the world, and the souls, and they're real. And a century later, Madhva comes. Big bloke, big son. He used to send his brahmacharis after, if there was an Advaitin giving a talk in town, he'd send his brahmacharis out to go, they basically vandalize the event. Yeah. He was a real warrior, but he calls his philosophy Dvaita, not Advaita, but Dvaita means dualism.
Right, yeah. Basically,
yes. So this is all part of.
You're wrong. You made a mistake. I mean, so why is it? I mean, let's move on. I suppose. I mean, well, let's actually. I mean, do you want to clarify the term monism first of all, because that's often used around Advaita, right? So, you know, so let's maybe just clarify that term, because you know these terms are bandied around a lot, and I think it's really helpful to have you here to just clarify some of these terms.
Well, Advaita, you know, non-dualism is not a term that Western philosophy is familiar with, but the term monism is a term that sort of is part of Western philosophical vocabulary. So it's supposed to be the same thing, because obviously if there's a mono, then it's not dual, right? That's the idea. So you can take them as synonyms, though some have argued there's some nuances of differences, but nothing that would need to detain us. You know, scholars are always trying to find some nuance of difference to scratch their egos with. But basically, monism is non-dualism. Yeah.
Right. Same thing. And basically, non-dualism we can say is, I mean, I know it could be conceptual here, but is it atheistic or
no?
So
the extent that the word classical Advaita, you know, Shankara.
Yeah.
He also writes a commentary in the Bhagavad Gita, right? Where Krishna says, "I am God," and for him, that's all. To the extent that the conventional world is real, to the extent that
there is a God,
the wall behind you, there's a red sari hanging up behind you. To the extent you've got earphones sitting on your head, to the extent you're sitting in front of the microphone, to that extent that in that world of the mirage, of course, there's a God. He would say, of course, there's a God. If there's a creation, there has to be intelligence that puts it together. He accepts that in convention. So is he an atheist? Is he ultimately an atheist? Insofar as ultimately there is no God, there's only this infinite, all-pervading Satchidananda Brahman. But he's a very strong theism in the sense that he debates the Sankhya atheists and he debates the non-theists but only
Right.
from the perspective of conventional reality. It's a bit hard to put him into our categories of theist and atheist, if you think about it.
Yes, yeah, it's a bit confusing, isn't it? I mean, to that end, why not clarify it against Samkhya and ideas of Purusha and Prakriti, or efficient and material cause, right? So, I mean, if we look at, I mean, my understanding of Advaita is that there's no material cause. If there is only Purusha, and it pervades, and material like Prakriti is actually Purusha in Advaita. There's only Purusha, right? And Samkhya would divide the two and say, well, there's something that's essentially real, and then there's a material. And Advaita comes along and says, well, there's only Purusha, and it pervades everything.
Yeah,
right?
well,
So
hang on a minute. Let's
yeah.
just tighten that up a little bit.
Yeah,
Some
sure.
would say there's Purusha and Prakriti, and one is chit and one is achit.
Yeah.
So Purusha is conscious.
Yeah.
And then the world of matter with all its evolution, unconscious. You could also say sat and asat. Yeah, let's go with chit and achit. Shankara would say okay, you could put it that, okay, Prakriti is Purusha, but as long as you're clear about this, there is no achit, there is no world. There's only Brahman, that which we think of as the world is a superimposition. Now let's think about this word superimposition. Let's go with something we know. We know that if you're in the desert, you're dehydrated, and you're stumbling about the sand dunes, you can actually project a mirage onto the sand dunes, and it really looks like there is an oasis with palm trees. And because you're in a state of dehydration, you project that image, and it's not really there. So that's not a bad, he likes that one. He'll use that one. Well, he uses the other one of the snake and the rope. Go along the road, and it's really a rope, but you superimpose snakeness onto what is really a ropeness. And then when you realize your mistake, you realize, oh, there's no snake at all, there's only a rope. And so same thing as the mirage. Now, within the mirage, okay, if you accept that there's a mirage, well, there's a palm tree, it's not an elephant, there's water, it's not a bloody, skyscraper. So there's a logic to the mirage, and he'll defend that. Oh yeah, if there is a creation, there's a creator, and the world is real, and he'll debate the Buddhists and the Sankhya people. But ultimately, it's a superimposition. So it's not, and we'll look at the problem with that in a minute, but it's not that Prakriti is Purusha. You could put it that way, as long as when you say that you mean, or you meaning one means.
Yeah.
Actually, there is no Prakriti in the first place. There only ever was Purusha. Of course, he uses the term Brahman and Atman.
Okay.
Yeah, but he would use the term Brahman. There's only ever been Brahman. There only ever was desert dunes. There never was a mirage.
Yeah. I suppose perhaps to clarify or get out of this little mistake that I fell down to, there's only chit. There's no achit.
No achit at all.
Yeah.
It's only sat and chit, and then he adds ananda because of the Brihadaranyaka. Now here's where Ramanuja would, like I said, 100 pages, right? So he'll take the let's go with the snake and the rope, because Shankara likes that. He says, all right, you project snakeness onto ropeness only because you have a mental imprint of a snake. Now you've misplaced it, fine, to be sure, but where did that original snake imprint come from? It could only have come from a real snake that you saw a day before yesterday. Now you made the mistake of projecting it today where it shouldn't be projected. There must have been a real snake somewhere that entered into your mind through your senses and implanted a samskara that it is then now in your mind that can be projected inappropriately. So therefore, if you say the world is a superimposition upon Brahman, where does the imprint of the world come from that it can be superimposed? We know where the imprint of a mirage comes from. We've seen palm trees, we've seen oases of water, and then we just inappropriately project it onto a sand dune. So that's another. So these kinds of arguments are pretty robust arguments. And
we have a similar thing in empiricism in the Western tradition, right? If you can think of a pink unicorn, it must have some sense of reality somewhere.
Yeah.
you know, whether real or in parts, you know, it has to come from somewhere, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's starting to sound
psychology. That's yoga psychology. The mind cannot conjure up anything unless it's got the bits and pieces of samskara.
Yeah.
You can make a black flamingo, but you can't. You superimpose, but you can't make up anything completely unknown.
But you know, they change color anyway, don't you? It's the fish. They eat the fish and they go pink. They start off white. They start off white. Yeah, they're around here. There are loads of them around here. And they start off white in the winter and then they eat loads of fish and they go pink. But in patches. They're never as pink as you see them in the, you know, in the pictures. Yeah. There you go. Carry on. Right. So where are we? Have we moved on to why Advaita is so popular yet?
Well, you know, I can only speculate, but there's been some. It was actually.
And it's Neo-Advaita as well, isn't it? Really, that we're talking about now.
Because it's not really classical. There's much less emphasis on the unreality of the world, because that clearly is a really difficult one to defend. I think it starts in Bengal in the colonial period. You know, Vivekananda really was probably the main figurehead of Neo-Vedanta, right? So he's borrowing bits of, why is it Neo? Because it's bits of yoga, bits of bhakti, bits of all, yeah. But ultimately he's you know, if you read his writings, you know, the Advaita is there. So why is it popular? Well, because in a sense, you know, the colonial intellectuals and missionaries are ridiculing Hinduism, all these, you know, elephant-headed gods and 69 goddesses and how ridiculous, and, you know, how can God have an elephant head and all of this. So the Advaita Vedanta can say, well, yes, that's just sort of popular, conventional religion, but ultimately all of that is unreal. So that is a much more easier position to defend than a Vaiṣṇava who's going to say, yes, God is Narayan and he has 4 arms and he lives in Vaikuntha. And you know what I mean? Good luck with, you know, trying to come up with a rational, coherent explanation for that. So in that sense, it was appropriated by some Hindu nationalists. And
to kind of make things more palatable to defend against the British, right? Yeah.
And when it got exported in the 60s, you know, it's an easier philosophy to sort of, you know, accept that, you know, that all of these gods and goddesses, okay, they're only useful, they're kind of like conventionally real. So in the West, we might use the language of metaphor and symbol, which we're familiar with, although Advaita doesn't say that. But it's easy to sort of apply those terms, that these are metaphors or symbols to reach the divine, and the divine is beyond all of that. So it sort of fits more easily into a kind of, you know, new agey, non-sectarian, the truth is one, all paths flow into the one truth, which is kind of a non-philosophical, kind of very easy to, you know, we'll all hold hands and chant Om sort of thing, right? But which, of course, is not the history of Indian spirituality at all. It was debates, and there were, you know, the differences were recognized very, very clearly by the theologians. So, you know, that might be one reason. And then, you know, a lot of the 60s gurus came out of the Neo-Advaita lineages, like Shivananda's disciples that were Advaitins. Great Shivananda from Rishikesh, who was a real scholar, was a real yogi. His disciples, Satchidananda and Swami Vishnu Devananda, they were also real yogis in their own right, but they were, you know, they made an impact in the 60s. They were Advaitins, and on the other side, you find Krishnamacharya, you know, and you find Guruji Iyengar not really representing their non-dual, you know, they were not Advaitins. They were not representing the sort of, we can call them dualistic, but that term is not quite accurate. They weren't representing these traditions in their teaching. We don't see any of that in Guruji Iyengar's. I personally asked him one time I met him. I said, "You still identify with that Vishishta Advaita, Ramanuja?"
I know you asked him the 3 questions. I saw that in another interview. I've got 3 questions for you.
But it wasn't part of his teachings. So
why not? Why not? I mean, what I wanted to ask you is, do you think it's something that this doership thing with Advaita, right? There is no doer, there is no effort to make, right? I mean, it's kind of a convenient. Do you think it's like a kind of a lazy person's practice, really, or a convenient thing to think? Well, there's no sadhana to do. Whereas you're telling me that actually the Advaitins do sadhana, you know, and there's because this kind of, you know, the lack of a person doing anything or the lack of anywhere to get or to do, it somehow fits more, doesn't it, right, than the idea of yoga as transforming from one thing to the other. Or, I don't know, do you want to speak about that at all?
Yeah, but in classical Advaita, that's not the philosophy at all. As long as you're in conventional reality, as long as you're
there is something to do.
You have to be as intense as the yogis and the Sankhyans and all the other schools and the Buddhists. You have to have that level of intensity to get out of the illusion. What lies on the other side, that's a different thing. But when you're under it, it's not a lackadaisical, there's no doer, there's nothing to be done.
I think that's how it's framed now. Yeah.
Those sound bites might be true on the highest level, but they don't apply in conventional reality for real Advaita Vedantins. Yeah, I mean, and their sadhana is primarily, by the way, the study is Jnana Yoga.
Right. And how and what does that entail? I mean, we know the Ramana Maharishi is the who am I kind of question. Is that the fundamental, kind of
sort of like that? In other words, we're under this cognitive illusion, and the way out is not so much through action, although they do the pujas and the rest of it, but really it's through correcting our understanding. So therefore, through the study of the text and internalizing the text and really meditating on the great statements of the Mahavakyas of the Upanishads, this is more of a Jnana Yoga practice, not a Chitta-Vritti Nirodha practice, but it is absorbing in the mind, in the Vedanta Sutras, in the Upanishads, in the Upasanas, which means meditating on the kind of symbols of Brahman in the Upanishads. By doing that, the mind becomes totally Brahmanized, and at a certain point you have this eureka moment, which is a very interesting, mysterious moment in all these traditions. How do you transition from a mental state to an actual perception of reality? The mental state is, okay, the world is false, well, you can go around, you're mumbling that to yourself all day, right? Sure. But when do you actually cease to see the world?
Yeah.
That eureka moment, same with Patanjali, right? You nirodha. And then all of a sudden you're going to have this transitional moment when Svarupevasthanam becomes your experience. The same with the Krishna Bhakta. You're meditating on a form of Krishna made of samskaras, right? You got your blue that you from your Levi gene, right? You got your yellow from your whatever, when it's dhoti, you got a peacock feather that you saw on the peacock. You're putting it together with a flute that they, like the one you played in school. You're putting this melange together, and at some point, that mental composite, suddenly have a eureka moment, and the actual Sri Krishna is there, resplendently manifesting. So all these traditions have that pivotal transitional moment, which is very
kind of sounds slightly tantric, really, that the sacrifice ends up having some kind of ontological status in itself.
Well, the point being that it always was ontologically real. Like for Advaita Vedanta, everything actually is Brahman. But there has to be a transitional moment from you just telling yourself the story that everything is Brahman, everything, your world is false, world is false. The transitional moment to actually experiencing it that way. And the same with Patanjali. There has to be that moment from Nirodha. Still, it's a mental state, right? Even Asmita Samadhi is still a mental state. And all of a sudden, it has to be this pivotal moment when all of a sudden, bada boom, mind is no longer functioning at all. And now Svarupevasthanam, and the same with what I was saying about Krishna. There has to be a moment from a mental construct to an actual darshana, an actual vision of God. We're wondering a bit here, but but all of
it seems to me.
Yeah,
no, it's good. It's good. I mean, just trying to clarify the terms around this idea, because it's being used a lot, I think, and and I don't think it's always understood as clearly as it could be. But I mean, what about the idea of transformation in Patanjali being a transformation from one state to the other? He does seem. I mean, you're the guy on Patanjali, really. He does seem to say that there's a new mind is born, right? Like from Chitta-Vritti, at the end of the Samadhi Pada, we have like something new. So you're going from one state to the other, whereas in Advaita, there's no other state, obviously. So you're kind of unpeeling, or I mean, like you're kind of, it's a transformation, but not a transformation from one thing to another, but kind of like within itself, kind of thing.
Well, there's an overlap and there's a difference, right?
Right.
Yes, the mind is transforming, becoming more and more sattvic. You're going through the yamas, niyamas, sattva. then you finally samadhi, some kind of stability, and then you're transforming it up through savichara, nirvichara, right? Savita, right up asmita. These are all mental states. The mind is real, but the point is you want to go to a transmental state where it's a svarupa vastanam, where mind is near bija. There are no more bijas. There's nothing. The mind, but it's still there. It's just awareness is no longer aware of it. In Shankara, there's this overlap with that. You're trapped in conventional reality. You use the mind. You're not nerodering it, filling it with jnana, studying the Upanishads, internalizing, world false. You go around telling yourself a story, right? But then all of a sudden, there's going to be this eureka moment. So the mind is transforming, eventually becomes 100%, Patanjali 100% still. Advaita 100% permeated with Upanishadic knowledge. All of a sudden, there's this eureka moment, and then there's no more mind anymore. And there's just an infinite experience of transmental Satchidananda.
They're going to the same place. Are they ending up the same place?
I think they are. Not Krishna Bhakti, that's another thing.
Yeah.
Not Vaishnavas. They don't want nothing to do with this. They don't want an experience of just their Atman. They want an experience of Bhagavan, who's a real being, wonderful.
But potentially would still say that there's independent jivas, like loads of little jivas and one big, right? And Advaita, I guess there's just emerging into.
Yeah, but they'll be relevant. The experience is the same. When Sankhya and Yoga talk about the experience of Swarupa Vastanam, the theoreticians may say there's a bunch of individual Atmans, all simultaneously having the same experience, but the experience is infinite, eternal consciousness. The experience of Advaita Vedanta is eternal, infinite consciousness. Experiences are the same. There's no difference in the way that they are described. The difference then is the theologians. The difference is, well, for those who are not enlightened, Sankhya says the world is real, souls are eternally individual. Shankara says the world is unreal, individuality is also unreal. So, but that's a theoretical difference that the philosophers are debating over. The experience is the same. Infinite, eternal, pure consciousness with no objects. Non-dual. It's a non-dual experience. There's no duality, even in Patanjali. Duality is real and existing for others. So it's really not a big difference. It's not a big difference in terms of the grand finale goal.
What about text to read? If anyone's trying to read something on Advaita and they'd like to study it more, is there anything that kind of is entry level and makes reasonable sense immediately to people interested?
I think people should read the actual text themselves, because so much activity has been done.
In Sanskrit.
No, not necessarily, but read.
Any particular Upanishad you can think of? Katha Upanishad, or?
The thing is, the Upanishads are not either monistic or dualistic.
Right. Okay.
Later traditions that are monistic and dualistic. The Upanishads don't use these categories. They just talk about Brahman, and here it's person, and there it's not a person. Here the soul is real, and there it's not real. So it gives you. That's how you can have sects, because these are amazing scholars. They're not fools. They know Sanskrit since they were 5. They're speaking in Sanskrit at home with their Brahmin dads. So how is it that they differ so enormously? Because the Upanishads allow that. Allow both types of interpretation.
Finally, what about? How would you compare Buddhism to Advaita?
Well, Shankara, if you look at the 2nd chapter of Vedanta Sutra, he debates Buddhism. He rejects Buddhism on the grounds. Okay, so Buddhism now is a real world, not an illusion. But they agree. Differences that for Shankara the Atman is eternal and infinite and autonomous, can abide in its own nature. In Buddhism, the Atman is momentary. It's only momentary flow of consciousness that's always interdependent with its objects. It can never be absorbed in its own nature. There is no. In fact, for Buddhism, that own nature is avidya. To think that it has a swarupa.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah.
There's very big differences philosophically.
But the kind of emptiness or fullness, the shunyata, or shunya, is very similar to Advaita. That's what I was thinking, right?
Well, they would say
this purna vida, purna midam, this kind of emptiness is fullness, and fullness is emptiness.
Yeah, but that's not a Buddhist. That's the Upanishad. The Buddhists shouldn't be using that. But the Buddhists. They have their own text. They don't quote the Upanishads. Maybe in the early period they did, the Mandukya. But anyway,
I was relating that text to Buddhism and to the idea of No, I wasn't quoting as a Buddhist. They used to be using this text.
Sure, but emptiness means that nothing has inherent independent existence. Everything is interdependent with other things, like Indra's net. Like the knot on a net is not an isolated thing. It's 4 bits of string feeding together, and they create the knot in the middle. The knot is not an existentially autonomous, independent thing. It's dependent on the 4 bits of string coming into it to make the knot in the net. So therefore, what shunyata is often misunderstood. Shunyata means nothing has inherent, essential existence. If number one, because it's momentary. If something is a momentary, has no essence. If it's an essence, that essence survives, right? That's what an essence is, something that doesn't change. Nothing has an essence like that for the very simple reason it's momentary, number one. And an essence is something which is immune from anything else. It abides in its own glory, in its own essence. So number two, the Buddha says, not only is everything momentary, but it's always interdependent with other things. So that's what shunyata means. It comes to mean certainly in Madhyamaka philosophy. Remember, these terms have different histories even within the different Buddhist schools.
Right. Whereas in Advaita, there's nothing, essentially, the world isn't real. It's, and the interdependence is an illusion as well, right?
Yeah, because there's no two things. How can anything be interdependent if there's only one entity, number one? And that entity does have an essence, an eternal Sat Chid Ananda essence that abides in its own autonomy. Not only does it not need anything else, but there is nothing else for Dvaita Vedanta, for it to be dependent with or interdependent with. It's pretty different.
Yeah. I think it's useful. I mean, just to bring in different kind of philosophies, right, to compare them to Advaita, because Advaita is such if you've argued with anyone who's interested in Advaita, it's such a difficult position to argue against, right? Because there is only one thing, so it kind of constantly circles around this, but
then you just have to hack away at what is Maya then. That they just and then you'll see that the Advaitins you'll never get an answer to that. And that's what their opponents have done for 1,200 years. That's their main argument. What is this?
Right.
Where does the superimposition come from? Where does the superimposed world, where does that image come from? And you won't get an answer there. At that point, then they would say, well, when you're in the illusion, how are you supposed to be, when you're in the illusion, you're deluded. So you can't answer that. I mean, you get some kind of a non-philosophical response, at which case, what do? You just say,
I'll make a cup of tea and thanks very much.
Let's talk about something else.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks again, Edwin, for clarifying another term, and I hope we can talk again soon to chat about something else. I mean, I suppose the thing with the Advaita is that people often use it as but an idea to do whatever they want in the world, because there's no doer, there's no illusion, right? So there's no practice necessary. So it's a kind of but it's been
that's not Advaita Vedanta. They're serious practitioners. They're serious. I mean, the Vaiṣṇavas will object to that, their ultimate ontology, but they're respect-worthy. They've commanded Vedanta responses. Nobody can establish a Vedanta position without engaging Advaita. So the real Advaitins are highly respect-worthy people. They're learned. They're the yamas, niyams, the whole thing. They're sannyasa, they're strict. The reason, in my opinion, if I may just say this, that the Vaishnavas object to Advaita Vedanta. They have no problem with it. They accept that you can experience your own Atman, and when you're in that state, it's exactly what Advaita says it is. They don't deny that. It's an eternal, autonomous, there's no dualities, there's no awareness of either the world or other souls. So whether they exist or don't is completely redundant when you're in that state. It's just a theoretical question. Where the Vaishnavas, why they really invest so much in opposing Advaita, it's not because of that experience, they accept that experience. It's because Advaita tells them that their beloved Bhagavan is Maya. Their beloved Lord, that is the goal of their life, the goal of their bhakti, the goal. For them, it's not just a path to some impersonal end. It is the path and the end. They want that relation. For them, that relationship is eternal in this world and in Vaikuntha and Goloka in the Brahman dimension. And if you when Advaita, that's why they call them Mayavad. If you tell a Vaiṣṇava, your beloved Bhagavan is Maya, that's when the Vaishnavas really feel that it's their duty to their beloved to defend the reality of God. So that's where Ramanuja ends up writing 100 pages. Otherwise, he wouldn't care. Maybe
you can do that next time.
Yeah, like yoga, you don't
you
care.
Can defend,
because
you can defend Krishna.
Ishvara, right? Yoga accepts Ishvara. It doesn't say anything about Ishvara. It doesn't talk about bhakti, but as long as you accept Ishvara, fine. You want a Swarupa Vastanam, you want that as your grand finale. Good, God bless, good luck, go for it. But don't come telling a Vaishnava that Bhagavan is illusory, because then you end up in, then you're going to have this, very sort of intense philosophical response.
All right.
Yeah.
That was good.
All right.
Thanks for that. Good to see you. All right.
All right.
Cheers. Yeah. I'll speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye. Bye now.